Hello there, and welcome to NavyCon 2021. We are so happy to have each of you virtually with us today. And I want to welcome each of you to the War and Society panel, where you're going to get some really great Star Wars content and then some other non-Star Wars content. I kid, of course. My name is Thomas Harper. I'll be your moderator. My job is to steer this ship directly into the ground, I guess. I'm a reserve major in the United States Army Reserve, where I serve as a defense counsel. I'm a judge advocate by trade. You'll be hearing from me only to navigate through our great set of panelists here. And the War and Society panel is the idea behind this collection of presentations is that war is a fundamentally political act with implications for society and the military. This panel is going to explore political, social, cultural aspects of national security through the lens of Star Wars and some other stuff. I'm a kid, of course, but Star Trek and Babylon 5 will also play huge roles in our presentation, just as they've played huge roles and continue to play huge roles in this type of conversation in the real world. I want to introduce and go around sort of in a Hollywood Squares type format, our group of exceptionally talented panelists who have worked hard to bring you the great presentations that you're about to see. Our first panelist is Matt Bucher, and he's going to present Potemkin Paradise, the United Federation in the 24th Century. Matt is a United States Navy veteran, currently living in the Washington, D.C. area, working on his master's in history with a focus on public history at the George Washington University. Welcome, Matt. Next up, we have Elsa, whose presentation will be Beyond Loyalty, Duty, Honor, the Competing Paradigms of Civil-Military Relations in Babylon 5. Elsa is an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Currently, Elsa is a PhD candidate in Harvard University's Department of Government. S.H. Harrison is going to present Star Culture Wars, the negative impact of politics and imperialism on Imperial Navy capability in Star Wars. Harrison is an author, critic, and fanboy who takes a galaxy far away far too seriously. And I'm right there in that camp as well. Matthew Ader is going to present to you The Aristocrats Strike Back, reevaluating the political composition of the Alliance to Restore the Republic. Only nerds refer to it that way. To the rest of us, Matthew, it's the Rebel Alliance or the Rebels. Matthew's a student in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. His research is focused on the intersection of climate change and French strategy in North Africa. He's a frequent contributor to security blogs, including, and I'm going to butcher this, The Wavell Room, Grounded Curiosity, and Angry Staff Officer. And Lieutenant Colonel Bree Fram is going to close us out today. She's going to present on Leadership and Transitions, Lessons from Trill. Bree is a lieutenant colonel in the United States Space Force and is currently a student at the United States Navy U.S. Naval War College. She has commanded at the squadron level, led United States Air Force security cooperation with Iraq, served on the staff of Congresswoman Bordallo, and has led multiple space acquisition programs. So, as promised, you have an exceptionally talented group of panelists here with some fascinating topics. And without further ado, I want to kick it over to Matt for his presentation on the Federation. Matt, take it away.
Hey there, everyone. As Thomas said, my name's Matt. I'm a Navy vet. My undergrad was in international affairs, and I'm working on my history master's at George Washington University. Today, I'll be speaking with you about what I call the Potemkin Paradise, which is the Federation in the 24th century. This is, generally speaking, the next generation Deep Space Nine Voyager era. So why am I talking about this? Well, the Federation of the next generation era is held up as an aspirational example for a lot of us. You know, I kind of thought about this after, about once a month I see someone tweet or start a thread on Reddit saying, oh, we could have had Star Trek, but instead we got, Elysium, Warhammer 40K, Mad Max. Some people are into that. So, and why wouldn't you want to live in a federation? It's a society that prides itself on rule of law, sapient rights, Chekhov would say human rights, communitarian ideals, enlightened foreign policy on a post-scarcity society. The problem is the Federation foreign policy is realist rather than idealistic or enlightened. And the domestic policies tended to follow a failure of living up to these ideals. So I'm going to begin by talking about foreign policy briefly, and I'm going to use that to lead into some of the domestic ramifications of that. First of all, some key foreign policy assumptions. Assumption one is the Federation was kind of the top dog in the Alpha Quadrant, and by this I'm excluding people like the Travelers and the Organians, and this is because of in large part due to their technical advantage. So being the top dog, that gave them a lot of options. In number two, in general, the foreign policy was kind of enlightened, idealistic, and rational. This is manifested through the Prime Directive and great effort being made to in conflict avoidance. So let's talk about the first one, top dog. The Federation was a neo-pair of the Klingons, not the other way around. This is borne out by the performance of the Klingon Defense Force in the various Federation Klingon conflicts, to include, theoretical ones and the Yesterday's Enterprise timeline. And this is further supported by the Klingon Defense Force's performance against other powers, such as quickly overrunning the Cardassian Union and managing to hang on by itself against the Dominion Expeditionary Forces in the Alpha Quadrant. Now, Federation policymakers knew this, and they took advantage of a weakened Klingon Empire after the Praxis disaster to get them on board with an arms control treaty that substantially reduced the sizes of both fleets, and they even went so far as to managing, to a degree, bringing the Romulans in on it with a Treaty of Callan, which is a smaller arms control treaty. The whole Pax Federation of the 21st century was driven by this treaty system. So the problem with that is that once the Klingon Empire had recovered to the point where you had a resurgent expansionist regime under Gowron, and they decided they did not want to be part of the Kinmore Accords anymore, that became a crisis for the Federation, even though you had all these technical advantages. In this, the Federation was not able to translate its technical advantage, if indeed it existed, into military power. Well, what about its enlightened foreign policy in general? Well, I'm of the opinion that the Prime Directive is mostly used as an excuse to wash itself of making decisions and policies. The best example of this, it was just applied into consistently for it to be a real policy. The best example of this was the Federation agreeing to operate Deep Space Nine during Bajor's Federation candidacy period. This is just the most prominent example. There are all others intervening in the Klingon Civil War, stopping stellar objects from hitting planets, what have you. It's just an excuse to avoid making decisions. Second, the Federation routinely violated the territory of other states. I think probably the best example of this is when the Dominion instructed the Federation, hey, stay on your side of the wormhole. The Federation's solution was to take a barely working tech demonstrator and go on a deep reconnaissance of the Dominion territory. This was something that ticked all the boxes of what the paranoid founders thought of solids. So, again, wasn't enlightened. It was kind of a we need to know more about these people realist look. And finally, when the Federation made great efforts to avoid conflict, it was invariably Federation citizens that suffered. So to the left, we have a Tellurian and a human teenager. This human teenager had been a child on a Federation colonial ward that got bombed flat by the Tellurians if Tellurians adopted him. This is kind of a prominent example of fourth-rate powers like the Tellurians attacking Federation colonies, and there's a brief border war. that's mentioned, in the background, and apparently nothing is done about it. If you think this is just a one-off, to the right we have Captain Picard telling the residents of, I believe it's Doran 5, Doran 5, that they need to pack up and leave. We don't want to fight the Cardassians over this, so we agreed to a land swap. You guys had no input on whether or not you wanted to stay and the Federation will stay on this planet. And this was, again, this is not unique. The Cardassian border along the DMZ was the biggest example of this. In these colonies, well, there wasn't really a post-scarcity society. The desires of the citizens were not taken into account when they made agreements with fourth-rate powers like the Cardassians. Now, so what happened after that? Well, I would say the result of that is that the official Federation policy of treating these marginal wards as second-class citizens ended up with these citizens taking matters into their own hands. The Maquis were a group along the Cardassian border that decided to fight the Cardassians because they felt, correctly, as it turned out, that the Cardassians were arming their own colonists in the demilitarized zone, and Starfleet, decided to clamp down on it. We saw from this widespread extremism in Starfleet ranks. In fact, we saw, not counting Chakotay's band, which is the group of Maquis that joined Voyager, that was lost in the Badlands, we saw no fewer than 5 commissioned officers not express sympathy for the Maquis, not talk about it in the wardroom, but straight up join the Maquis and provide material help for it. So this extremism ran deep in Starfleet and the Federation's military. And by the way, Starfleet is the Federation's military. And how did the Federation agree to this? Well, one of the things they did was they continued to use Starfleet, which is a military branch, as law enforcement. So to the left, we have some civilians on the colony, I believe it's Volon 3, who are kind of backing away. Cisco's just shown up to tell them, hey, you guys are providing sympathetic to the Maquis. We're here to shake some trees loose. You can't do it. Where are the Maquis? Throughout the Next Generation era, we do not see, as far as I'm aware, one single Federation civilian law enforcement official at the Federation level. There are no Federation marshals. There is no Federation Bureau of Investigation. It's Starfleet. Now, Starfleet, there may be some justification for them to chase, ships around, but when they go to arrest a criminal, it's Starfleet that goes ashore. They don't go to a local constable and have them arrested. It's Starfleet that does the arresting. Jadzia Dax even said that on Risa, when you had these extremists who are trying to control, who are disrupting the weather patterns of that. Well, with Starfleet, we can arrest them. Apparently, in addition to being the military, they're also a general army in a paramilitary force that acts as police. Well, what about the justice system? To the right is Rear Admiral Bennett, who was a member of the Starfleet Judge Advocate General Corps, and that is him passing down a sentence to Richard Bucher. Richard Bucher was Julian Bucher, who was the Chief Medical Officer of Deep Space Nine, his father. And his judgment was he was issuing a sentence because when Julian was young, he took him outside of the Federation to be genetically augmented. Now, you can kind of wrap this up into a national security concern because you don't want another Khan Noonien Singh, running around and trying to become ruler of the Federation. But what we are fundamentally seeing is that in the 21st century, this is a society where the military is law enforcement, and the military is frequently acting as the judiciary against civilians. I would not describe either of those as something that we should be aspiring to politically. So I guess if I were to kind of give a bottom line of this whole thing is that, one, treaties will buy you peace. but you better have a backup plan, if the other party doesn't want to continue with it. Two, regarding foreign policy, no matter how enlightened you are, realist policies will always trump idealistic ones, especially in a crisis. Three, the most egalitarian military out there will still see extremism in the ranks. You need to keep a lookout for it. You can't just pretend it doesn't exist. It's bad for your security if you pretend it doesn't exist. And four, military forces and militarized law enforcement and judiciary is not in keeping with these democratic ideals. I'm not saying that the Federation is a bad place to live, far from it. It's just that we need to be careful not to be so blinded by the good aspects that we ignore or downplay the bad, because if we do that, we will never seek to improve, societies, whether fictional or not. I'm Matt Bucher. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and live long and prosper.
Outstanding work, Matt. Thanks for you almost converted me into a Star Trek fan. Almost, but not quite. Next up, we have the illustrious PhD candidate, Elsa Kania, who's going to give up her presentation on Babylon 5. Elsa, the floor is yours.
All right. Good evening. Hope you all are well, healthy, and getting vaccinated these days. And I'm excited to have the chance here at NavyCon to share a couple of initial reflections on a show that I started watching during the pandemic and against the backdrop of a lot of the turbulence in politics and civil military relations over the past year or so. So I'm a new fan of the show, and I've found it relevant and thought-provoking as a means to think through current dilemmas and challenges. So I won't quite manage to do justice to the plot in all its complexity or to the different nuances of the geopolitics, or perhaps we should say astropolitics, of the world of Babylon 5, but I will try to talk through a couple of the core dilemmas faced by leaders in Babylon 5, and especially of the commanders of the station, as they find the complexity and duality of their role transcend the norms of civil military relations and the norms of military professionalism in which they had initially been inculcated as officers of Earth Force. So again, Babylon 5, imagining a future of which the Earth Alliance has recently won or reached a stalemate, and after conflict with the Minbari, and Babylon 5 was created as in the hope of peace, as a space for diplomacy, for engagement among different alien civilizations, and operated by Earth Alliance through the command of Earth Force, but in partnership with and with extensive engagement with alien governments as well. And you see across these three commanders of Babylon 5, we see in the course of the show quite different outlooks on leadership and military professionalism as they grapple with the fraught circumstances in which they find themselves against the backdrop of crises in Earth politics, as well as the Shadow War, which I won't quite discuss in the detail it would merit, but would definitely recommend those who have not seen the show to check it out going forward. But in each of these officers serves as the station commander and essentially military governor, but is still also subject to the chain of command of Earth Force through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and has to navigate trying the conflicting loyalties and political imperatives that come with these roles against the backdrop of a situation in which governance on Earth is descending into totalitarianism. And after the explosion of Earth Force One, initially believed to be an accident, had killed the then president of the Earth Alliance, who had been supportive of the Babylon 5 project and encouraging of friendly relations between Earth and alien governments. The Babylon 5 team sees the rise to power of his former vice president, then President Clark, who declares an Earth-first approach and much more of a xenophobic outlook on the universe. And the Babylon 5 team gradually discovers the conspiracy behind that initial accident, which was in fact an assassination engineered by President Clark with alien influence in the process, and Clark proceeds to declare martial law, dissolve the Earth Senate, and created the Night Watch, a paramilitary organization that is responsible for countering subversion. So at this point, the constitution of the Earth Alliance has been violated by every means imaginable, and Babylon 5 team is in the difficult position of still being subject to the authority of Earth, even as they watch with dismay as the abuses of civil liberties and human rights by Clark, who has essentially seized power as an autocrat at this point in the show, these dynamics continue to worsen. And it was fascinating to see across the episodes and against the backdrop of various other happenings, the extent to which questions of appropriate respect for the chain of command become a major plot point and dilemma for Babylon 5's leadership. And at this point, Captain Sheridan is in the position of trying to receiving orders from Earth to accept the imposition of martial law on the station at the direction of the political office, and he ultimately concludes or realizes that he can avoid, at least in the meantime, the question of the imposition of martial law, because that order has come while from the president has not come through the proper chain of command with the Joint Chiefs, but rather the political office, and therefore he has the right and indeed the obligation to disregard it, and as to walk a balance between respecting Earth's authority and the commands he receives from Earth Force, but also trying to resist to the extent possible, even as that space continues to close. And in parallel, and perhaps by contrast, other Earth Force officers, including General Haig of the then Joint Chairman of the Joint Chief, had actually attempted to undertake a coup in response to Clark's declaration of martial law, and which sparked a series of defections within Earth Force. And as Clark's tyranny worsened, including attacks on Earth's colony on Mars, which involved bombing of civilian targets, many within Earth Force faced the fraught choices and decision in those circumstances of whether to obey those orders or whether to defect and refuse to obey and thereby be branded as traitors. And as this show continues, things start to escalate to a point where, after even worse attacks on civilian targets, and including on refugees and mass casualties, Captain John Sheridan, in his capacity as military governor of Babylon 5, declares that the station will follow other Earth colonies and succeed from Earth. And in response to these violations of the Constitution, abrogation of the appropriate civilian authorities, and again, the attacks on civilian targets, and that contravene the ethics and spirit of the Earth Alliance, and deaths of innocent, he justifies this step in terms of a moral imperative and declares Babylon 5's independence. And this is a rather remarkable transition and moment of disruption, and Babylon 5 from that moment forward becomes a source of resistance and a center of those who are opposing tyranny on Earth. As these politics and the worsening of the situation within the Earth Alliance continues across seasons to come, and eventually Babylon 5 becomes at the center of an alliance intended to liberate Earth, with support from other defectors from Earth Force as well as alien governments. And this culminates in a climactic battle of campaign for the liberation of Earth, and along the way a series of confrontations with fellow Earth Force officers and appeals to them to reject Clark's authority, to disobey orders that they should know are illegal. And while ultimately, I'll try to avoid spoilers as best I can in the course of the conversation, ultimately, against the backdrop of very dire circumstances, This campaign of liberation succeeds. President Clark commits suicide after last-ditch attempt at a scorched earth strategy, and Captain Sheridan has been successful and yet ultimately surrenders to Earth Force and is later forced to resign his commission as a condition for receiving amnesty from the Earth Senate, and ultimately the verdict on his behavior from the then acting president of the Earth Alliance is that he had led an insurrection against his own government. He had engaged in mutiny at best, treason at worst, and yet he was right morally, though is politically inconvenient. So his actions continue to be quite controversial within Earth Force, and in the aftermath of the liberation of Earth and the restoration of civilian authorities, he takes on a new role as president of a coalition that follows, but one of these salient dramas and tensions that continues under the commander who succeeds him, Captain Elizabeth Lockley, was that her choice in this role as the new commander and military governor of Babylon 5 is in part because she was among those Earth Force officers who had remained loyal to President Clark, despite his disbanding of the Senate, declaration of martial law, and the known atrocities and attacks on civilians that her fellow officers were directed to undertake, and her precise circumstances, and whether or not she was placed in a situation where she might have been directed to obey legal orders. That there's some ambiguity in the show as to her experience during that time, but I think the clearest moment where there is this tension between competing paradigms of military professionals, of what it means to be an Earth Force officer, comes in a confrontation between her and another of the Babylon 5 leadership, in which she ultimately violently disagrees with Captain Sheridan's previous actions. And she declares that you can take a stand without destroying your chain of command, and declares it wouldn't have been her place to tear up the Constitution. And trying to take a step back from the drama of Babylon 5 and look at this through the lens of some of our current debates and literatures on civil-military relations and civilian control. While I can't quite do these discussions justice, I'll try to point to some of these outlooks in order to argue why I think Captain Lockley's outlook here and her disagreement with Sheridan's in challenging circumstances and the suboptimal decisions he made in that role, why her argument doesn't stand up, and in fact reflects a perhaps dangerous misunderstanding on her part of what her responsibilities and obligations of an Earth Force officer would have been. And again, she articulates very much this norm of objective control, this idea of apolitical professionalism, that as an Earth Force officer, she should be above and beyond politics, irregardless seemingly of what is happening in politics. And as we've seen again in recent scholarship and debates in civil military relations, including work by Risa Brooks, there are certain paradoxes and contradictions that come with that idea of purely apolitical professionalism, which can in fact be detrimental. And when there are efforts, as happened in the Earth Alliance under President Clark, to politicize the military officers have to be engaged with and cognizant of politics in order to have effective and nonpartisan responses. And again, the demands of the profession demand engagement with politics and an awareness of a sense of the profession beyond a narrowly circumscribed role, and understanding of what an oath and obligation to the Constitution mean in actuality. And her argument that Captain Sheridan, perhaps by her view, ought to have adhered to the chain of command and not torn up the Constitution is inherently contradictory, given that the Constitution on Earth had already been flagrantly violated by President Clark, and with the intervention of the political office into the chain of command, the traditional chain of command was essentially null and void at that point. So those Earth Force officers who continued to obey orders under those circumstances, and those who obeyed illegal orders, such as firing on civilian targets in the indiscriminate bombing of Mars, were both wrong ethically and from the perspective of the norms and expectations of their profession. And again, we've seen recent debates as to how to understand ethics as not just merely involving loyalty that is in questioning, but rather the importance of disobedience, for instance, as Dr. James Carn has argued, and that there is a duty on officers to disobey unlawful orders. So I think in closing, I would say that I think the central drama of Babylon 5 around these questions of civilian control and civil-military relations has a certain resonance with debates we're seeing in our world and given recent events, and questions of what it means to be a military officer and professional, questions of the law of war, ethics when it comes to use of force, and question of understanding of lawful orders, and ultimately the importance of having an oath and loyalty to the Constitution. Not a party, a tyrant as was President Clark, or a political office. And the importance, again, I think of the disobedience of unlawful orders and the understanding of what is required both by law and by ethics, and the distinction between that relative to treason or insurrection. And again, I think these are complex issues that will merit further conversation, and one would hope in the world of Babylon 5 that in light of these events, they would continue to incorporate into their professional military education and debates on civil military relations as a society how to improve their understanding of these core issues of civics, ethics, and these core norms that are essential to any democracy. So I will stop there for now. We'll look forward to questions and continuing the conversation, and very honored to have a chance to join NavyCon and to take part in the panel this evening. Thank you all for your attention.
Outstanding work, Elsa. And I think if there are any network executives that happen to watch this, you've given them a litany of reasons to bring back Babylon 5 to answer all these questions and explore them. So plenty of good fodder there. And I will say, when you between law of war and lawful orders, or the lawfulness of orders, you're speaking my language. So outstanding work, and thank you very much. I want to invite everyone out there that's watching. Drop your questions that you have for any of these panels, for Elsa, for Matt, for anything that you see, into the Discord server. We're going to bring them on, and at the end of all of these presentations within this panel, we're going to have a combined moderated Q&A session. So get those questions ready. You can go ahead and drop them in. We've got producers that are checking the Discord to pull those over into our stream, and we appreciate all of you watching. Now, without further ado, I want to kick it over to Harrison and his presentation on Star Wars. Take it away, Harrison.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is S.H. Harrison. I'm a blogger, an aspiring author, and a Star Wars fan. I watched the original Star Wars when I was 6 years old on this old piece of technology called a VHS videotape. Which was made before things like the internet and special editions. So if you had told me when I was a kid that I would get to talk about Star Wars in front of an audience, 6-year-old me would have been thrilled. And so tonight I present to you a short piece on what every 6-year-old dreams of lecturing about, which is, of course, the negative impact of imperialist politics on the Galactic Empire's warfighting capability. So first, let's go through some quick history. As you'll all recall from the political documentary Revenge of the Sith, Chancellor Palpatine got himself elected Emperor of the Galaxy using some legislative maneuvers that might be considered questionable by some and a coup d'etat by others. The Emperor made a point of destroying or destabilizing historic Republic institutions, such as the Jedi Order and the Senate. Combined with its massive propaganda push, this suggests the historic challenge of this transition of power. And it is tonight's subject because the Palpatine regime's transition is by far the most interesting in history. You'll notice nobody remembers anything about the time Finis Valorum got elected chancellor. Due to its chaotic and illegitimate seizure of power, the Palpatine administration embraced authoritarian principles during the takeover transition. Despite its facade of absolute dominance, the Empire was in fact quite fragile in reality. Dozens or hundreds of resistance movements cropped up almost immediately, and despite its sizable advantages, the Empire was unable to effectively eliminate them. The relative impotence of the Imperial war machine is today's key theme. I posit that Palpatine's political outlook directly and fatally hampered the Imperial Navy, and therefore the Empire. The Palpatine regime's fragility and fascist underpinnings meant that it required three things to survive. Number one, external enemies to unite against. Number two, disproportionate resources to fight those enemies. And number three, an ideology that justified seizing those resources, which then creates new enemies and restarts the cycle. These are not novel requirements. We see them repeated over and over again throughout history by evil organizations in the Star Wars universe and outside of the Star Wars universe. Palpatine's empire then brought these requirements to life through classic imperialist doctrines, namely, number one, the expansion of territorial claims beyond legitimate borders. Number two, the replacement of laissez-faire free enterprise with a corporatist economy via unfair tariffs and questionable eminent domain practices. And number three, the creation of an ethnocentric ideology, high human culture, which was propagated through systemic racial prejudice. Each of these doctrines shores up a particular insecurity from the Palpatine administration's illegitimacy as a government. None was more crucial than high human culture, which posited that humans, and in particular male humans, were innately superior and deserving compared to all others. And thus, sending your Star Destroyers to conquer, annihilate, and terrorize aliens was not only acceptable, but required. The whole three-pronged approach to empire would fall apart without ethnocentric identity politics. Ideology was allowed to infest the strategic, operational, and tactical work of the Imperial Navy, and I use this term infest deliberately. Grand Moff Tarkin created a mission statement which was rule through fear of force rather than through force itself. The Tarkin Doctrine and the political ideology that it supported consistently superseded practical consideration for Imperial naval starship design and modus operandi. This allowed the more pragmatic Rebel Alliance to dominate the battlefronts, despite significant disadvantages in firepower and materiel. Now, I'm told I have 10 minutes for this presentation, not 10 hours, so I'm going to focus on just one area. The Imperial Navy repeatedly ignored the technological revolution in starfighter armaments, survivability, and logistical endurance in favor of the capability to simply intimidate through size and numbers. For proof, let's take a look at two of the icons of the Galactic Empire, Star Destroyers and TIE Fighters. Now, I have to say personally, I love Imperial Star Destroyers. I think they are a beautiful design that is fantastic to look at, and I have no doubt that they did a marvelous job for holograms that were pure propaganda and recruitment posters. However, as tools for actually fighting, they tended to fall disastrously short multiple times throughout the Star Wars series. After all, we see them get disabled by ion cannons, pushed into each other by frigates, one-hit KO'd by A-Wings, and most embarrassingly, outmaneuvered by the YT-1300 Millennium Falcon, a ship which was famously described as a piece of junk by radical cleric Luke Skywalker. The Empire had ample warning that the design of Imperial Star Destroyers was inadequate to modern warfare. The first time we see Star Destroyers getting beat up by an inferior force was at the Battle of Scarif. Here we see the Rebel Alliance come forward with a pragmatic approach centered mostly around starfighters, which makes sense because of their low cost and heavy armament. You'll notice here that Y-Wings, which at this point in time were already considered obsolete, antiquated, and very slow bombers, were nonetheless well-armed enough to disable a Star Destroyer at an opportune moment. 4 years later, we see the Rebels take the exact same set of tactics to the Battle of Endor. The Empire has had time to refine their technology and tactics, and yet they still insist on throwing swarms of poorly armed and poorly armored starfighters at the Rebels. This is amazingly ineffective. Case study. A pair of A-Wings armed with nothing but light concussion missiles is able to KO the shield generators on the Empire's flagship Super Star Destroyer, Executor. This leaves the flagship vulnerable to attack. Admiral Piet says, "Intensify forward firepower, I don't want anything to get through." Now, you'll recall that Jane's information group says that a Super Star Destroyer has almost 2,000 turbo laser batteries that are designed for ship-to-ship combat, but only 250 point defense weapons. The Executor was 19,000 meters long, which means assuming an even coverage dorsal and ventral, that there were on average 6 total point defense turrets to cover each kilometer of ship length. In the event that a high-speed fighter needed to be destroyed, its protection was amazingly inadequate. So you can kind of guess what happens next. Again, let me emphasize, 4 full years after the Empire lost the Battle of Scarif because of its lack of decent point defenses and durable starfighters, the Empire lost the Battle of Endor because of its lack of decent point defenses and durable starfighters, despite having what Zahn and other reputable historians consider to be a 10-to-1 numeric advantage. Now, it's not an engineering problem. We know the technology is possible because the Rebel Alliance is able to deploy it and the Imperials are not. You'll notice that no Imperial starfighters knock out Rebel capital ships during the series, despite the fact that the Rebel capital ships are just converted hospital ships, container ships, and cruise liners. The conclusion from the evidence must be that the Empire was poorly prepared by choice. And that choice is to focus on propaganda and intimidation value. The primary weapon systems of Star Destroyers are turbolaser batteries, which are designed for ship-to-ship combat and through the base Delta Zero protocol, the destruction of planetary surfaces. Extremely helpful for creating grand political gestures and not so much for actual warfare. Similarly, we see from the Rebel X-Wings that heavy armament and hyperdrive are possible for small starfighters, yet the Empire insists on poorly equipped TIE fighters, which can only use primitive human wave tactics to overwhelm their enemies. Poor capability, limited entirely by choice. For the Rebel Alliance, an investment in starfighter equipment and tactics represented innovation, a powerful force unleashed from its flexible mindset. That mindset, in turn, had its roots in the Rebel Alliance's racial and socioeconomic diversity. It's not a coincidence that the Battle of Endor was won by a leadership team that was not only racially diverse, but also socioeconomically and ideologically diverse as well. The rebels set aside systemic biases, instead focusing on bringing together as wide a range of qualified leaders as possible. Part of this was due to necessity, but it also reflected longstanding rebel values. A respect for diversity allowed for a willingness to innovate and take risks. And this willingness to innovate and take risks and the Empire's fixation on politics over practicality together represented an insurmountable mismatch in favor of the rebels. Again, I want to emphasize, better technology was available to the Empire, as demonstrated by the TIE Defender fighter, which was a heavy-hitting platform borrowing Rebel Alliance design principles and championed by a racial minority and network outsider, Grand Admiral Thrawn. Had the Empire had the combination of humility and backbone to widely adopt these tactics, it would have easily crushed the rebellion. But because of its adherence to fascism, the Empire was biased at both the institutional and individual levels, unable to conceive of a better way because doing so would mean admitting the worth of peoples not centered in its ethnocentric worldview. Ultimately, politics was able to override the military because the Empire's illegitimacy demanded intimidation through grandiose gestures in order to maintain power. And as you can see, when political gestures meet actual military competence tends to win out. Thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks so much, Harrison. Outstanding work, and that's in no way biased by my love of Star Wars, as is not evidenced at all behind me. So we're going to speed along, and our next presentation stays in the galaxy far, far away, and we're going to go to Matthew Ader. Matthew, take it away.
Awesome. So I am coming to you live at 2 a.m. from my kitchen to tell you why the Rebel Alliance were actually a bunch of self-interested aristocrats who are more fit for Downton Abbey than leading a revolution. Or at least that's one perception. So first of all, I think it's worth addressing this idea of the rebels as freedom fighters, because that's what we're told they are, right? In universe, Mon Mothma and Leia give us these grand speeches about freedom from fear and the restoration of democracy. And of course, out of universe, the rebels are coded very strongly after the Western allies in World War II. Most notably, of course, the Dambusters raid and the Death Star attack look very similar indeed. And I would actually argue that certainly at the leadership level, the Rebel Alliance was not so uncritically moral and liberatory in character. I would want to add a couple of caveats before I go any further. First, the Empire is still worse than the Rebels, just because I think the Rebels are complex does not mean the Empire is good. And secondly, many members of the Rebel Alliance genuinely did fight for democracy or for local liberation. My main argument and critique is aimed at their leadership level. And speaking of leaders, so who's actually running the show here? Well, it tends to be, mostly aristocrats and sort of privileged elites. And this goes right back to the founding of the Alliance. So this is a deleted scene from Revenge of the Sith showing a meeting of anti-Palpatine senators who would go on to form the core of the Rebel Alliance. Bail Organa here led it throughout the kind of pre-Yavin period. Mon Mothma just appearing at the side there led it during the Civil War. Padme Amidala did die, in fairness, but her children, including Princess Leia Organa, were of course critical players. Even when we look outside of the civilian leadership, look at the military stuff like Jan Dodonna and Admiral Akbar, they come from elite military backgrounds in the sense that they are often generationals their families have served in senior positions in the Republic military for generations, even centuries. So we're talking about a pretty privileged group of people. I might say, okay, sure, so maybe they are cultural elites, social elites, whatever it might be. But that doesn't mean they're self-interested. We need to really look at what they're fighting for. What are their grievances? And luckily, Mon Mothma wrote them down for us. So this is a segment from her Declaration of Rebellion, because it seems that not even the galaxy far, far away is safe from Thomas Jefferson, where she notes down sort of some of the key grievances driving the rebellion's decision to go to war. And at first glance, this seems like a pretty sensible set of problems. They talk about the erasure of democracy, about genocide and speciesism, and these are obviously bad things we want to avoid. So this doesn't seem at first glance like a great bit of evidence for me in saying the rebels are really all self-interested aristocrats. However, I think if we look more closely at the institutions of the Republic which they want to bring back, we can very clearly see that what they're really fighting for is not democracy, the voice of the people, but rather a resumption of an aristocratic clique governing the galaxy. And also, I'd argue from sequel trilogy material, their commitment to sapient rights is pretty flimsy at the best of times. We'll get to that a bit later. But first, about the Senate. So we're told it's a democracy. It isn't. The Senate is, in fact, highly unrepresentative and seemingly at least somewhat hereditary. So the Senate, we're told both in and out of the universe, as of the prequels, it cannot be seen as a legitimate representative organ. Each sector only has one senator, and it takes a lifetime, we're told explicitly a lifetime, to tour even a fairly lightly populated sector. In fact, we're told also in the Clone Wars cartoon that senators very rarely leave Coruscant, or indeed their home worlds when they do go back to their sectors. And even Padme Amidala, who is a very well-traveled senator, is unaware of the impact of the Clone War on civilians upon her constituents until one of her staff members has to tell her. So it doesn't really seem that the Senate represents the views of their constituents in any meaningful sense. Rather, it represents their own views and the views of their friends and acquaintances. And just who are their acquaintances? What is the kind of class of senators? And it seems to be they are majority sort of oligarchs and aristocrats. So this very photogenic character here is Lux Bonteri. He was a senator for Onderon, and he inherited his position from his mother, Mia Bonteri. Leia Organa, my understanding, inherited her position from her father, Bail Organa. Padme Amidala was elected, in fairness, but she was the queen before that, and before that came from my understanding, a fairly noble family, as did Mon Mothma on Chandrila. It's really unclear that sort of there's any kind of elections and democracy going on, and even if there is, it seems to predominantly stem from the elite, rich classes of important worlds. Notably, Amidala, for example, is seemingly elected only by citizens of Naboo, or at least principally by citizens of Naboo, even though she represents an entire sector, including many other worlds. Now, you might say, okay, sure, these critiques are reasonable, but this is the Old Republic. What about the New Republic? Surely they would have reformed things. And unfortunately, they don't. Or rather, they don't reform the Senate, except to give it more power. So Mon Mothma, as first Chancellor of the New Republic, gutted the power of the Chancellor's office, involving getting rid of the military, which I'll cover a bit more later, and also sort of making mobile capitals, all sorts of things. But so clearly there was willingness and capital to do reforms. However, the Senate wasn't actually reformed in terms of this democratic deficit I've identified, nor was it sort of given more oversight and sort of less authority. In fact, it's given more authority to control, for example, declarations of war, peace, and management of conflict. So it seems that if you sort of take a step back, that what we see with people like Mon Mothma and other senators is they had a great deal of unaccountable power and privilege under the Old Republic system, were deprived of it due to Sheev Palpatine's constitutional and not constitutional maneuvering, therefore started a war to get it back again. And once they did, they proceeded to enjoy that power and authority. And this, I think, is further evidenced when we look at the key political debate in the post-Endor period, that between the populists and the centrists. And as you can see, I am not particularly keen on those particular names for the factions. The populists are led by Leia Organa. They are comprised mostly of Rebel Alliance grandees, mostly from the core worlds and the inner rim, if Wikipedia isn't lying to me anyway. And their whole thing is having a very weak central government, as weak as can be managed. The centrists, while admittedly from moneyed classes, appear more to come from the mid-rim and the outer rim, and they support a strong central government. Now, the obvious takeaway, and the takeaway which we get in Bloodlines, where this kind of conflict is described in more detail, is the populists are upholding the Rebel Alliance and its legacy, and the centrists are all dirty Imperial sympathizers. And that's a perfectly reasonable read on a situation. But I do think there's enough evidence to suggest that actually what the populists are doing is they're trying to remove and oppose any barriers to the exercise of core world aristocratic rights and privileges. And what the centrists are trying to do, given they lack the influence, resources, and wealth of the core worlds and their networks, what they're trying to do is establish a counterbalance to them in the form of a strong central government. Now, you might say, look, this is all a bit theoretical, it's a bit, wishy-washy politics and political factions. And I might agree. But we also have the advantage of knowing what kind of galaxy the New Republic made. So the Rebel Alliance won, so what did they do with that victory? And what we see isn't especially pretty. And as The Mandalorian shows us, 5 years post-Endor, so 4 years after the end of the Civil War, the Battle of Jakku, the galaxy is still in a bit of a mess in the Outer Rim in particular. There is rampant slavery and warlordism. In Alphabet Squadron, which admittedly does take place a bit closer to Endor, we're told that piracy and predation on space lanes is up by about 500% on Imperial levels. This is not to say, I should add again, that the Empire was better at this kind of stuff. Merely the Empire's violence was often more state-directed. But it's very clear that the Rebel Alliance and the New Republic, which followed them, seemingly was unable to, and indeed disinterested in, due to disbanding their military, conducting policing and peacekeeping operations outside of the core worlds. And this is very strange if you believe and take at face value the claim that the Rebel Alliance wanted sapient rights and to stop genocide and that sort of thing. But if you take my position that they're really a bunch of core world aristocrats interested predominantly in their own privileges, it makes perfect sense that they wouldn't bother dealing with these kind of problems. Because for one thing, why should a Chandrilan citizen spend money resolving problems at Tatooine? And secondly, why would they want to pay for the upkeep of a national military, which would undoubtedly be a potential counterbalance to their own power and influence? Okay, so taking a quick step back as we wrap up here. Obviously, this is a pretty bloody-minded reading of canon, and if you showed it to George Lucas in 1977, he'd probably call you a maniac. I mean, yes, I think that's fairly reasonable to say. However, I do think there's enough evidence within the canon as a whole to reimagine the Galactic Civil War not as a binary matter of freedom versus autocracy, but rather as a group of civilian bureaucratic elites who have been displaced from the levers of galactic power by military autocrats and are trying to get that power back and ultimately succeed in doing so. And while this is a pretty bleak reimagining of a sort of classic fairy tale universe, I think it is an interesting one and perhaps something which can inspire further discussion and debate. And I look forward to the Q&A, and back to you, Thomas.
Thanks so much, Matthew. I'm sad to be leaving the galaxy far, far away, but the bright spot at the end of this panel is Lieutenant Colonel Bree Fram, who's here to talk to us about lessons from Trill. Colonel Fram, Bree, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. Really excited to be here tonight because when I saw that the theme of this convention was national security and transition. I said, I have to put something together. Even if I have to reach back to my nerdy roots to do it, I would be remiss if I didn't. So why me on this topic of leadership and transition? And really, more importantly, this subtitle about, why do transgender leaders thrive in a VUCA galaxy? We're going to look at that through the lens of Trill experiences, but first, a little about the why me question. So really, dreams change, but in some ways they stay the same. So when I was young, I had a friend that dragged me almost kicking and screaming to watch an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation with them. But after that, my future switched in an instant. I went from wanting to study dinosaurs, just like my daughter does today, to immediately like, I'm going to make the warp engines go. I want to be an engineer. I want to be Geordi. But I didn't see the possibilities in my life at that point. And what turns out, that Geordi wasn't the right example. It was another Starfleet engineer that was who I really was. So now, as the senior ranking out transgender officer within the Department of Defense, I'm Jadzia Dax. And the story of the Trill makes it fit so perfectly. Even though an artist friend of mine said, no, you're really more of a Janeway at this point, I still like to think, I'll wear that blue uniform for a while yet before I put the red one on for the rest of my career. But let's go back and let's talk Trill. Why is it that Trill become such amazing leaders, or even, again, such amazing representatives in the field, whatever it is, that they choose to engage in? So there's species that the Trill in general are kind of a baseline humanoid species. There's nothing all that special about them. But what makes a tiny fraction of their population unique is their ability to host a second symbiotic organism just known as the symbiont. And the symbiont lives far longer than any individual Trill. And when a Trill takes on that symbiont, they have access to the memories and the experiences and everything that their previous host has experienced. And though they have their own personality, their own desires and dreams, when they take on this symbiont, their world explodes. It explodes in a realm of possibilities of what can be done. And if we look back at why is this relevant to leadership? Sure, experience and having all this is relevant, but there's more to it than that. A lot of it is about perspective taking and that ability to see things from multiple different angles. There's that great classic analogy that, a bunch of blind people feeling an elephant, you're going to get very different views of what that is depending on where you are around the elephant. But if you put it all together, you can see the big picture and understand what it is. And in a 1936 interview, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the famous author, when he was asked about what's the test of a first-rate intellect, well, he said it was the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind and at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And so if we talk Trill, you're talking far more than two. They're still very functional and they can see things from so many different angles and be able to attack problems in a way that we might not otherwise do. And in his recent book on grand strategy, John Lewis Gaddis kind of uses that analogy as well in his description of leadership, saying you have to have these two competing views where one is the vision of where am I going and how do I focus on getting to that objective? But there's this other view of I need to look all around me and I need to see what's going on. I need to understand the context and what's changing, what's cropped up. And this clash and this tension between the two of them is really important to actually safely navigate you to where you need to go. And the Trill as leaders, as we've seen with the examples on the screen more recently, you're starting to see it in Discovery episodes, they simply have this ability to navigate these multiple perspectives and come up with solutions that no one else on their own can do. They're like their own individual team. So this perspectives, it really gives them superpowers in a way from their multiple lived experiences and perspectives. So to bring this back to Earth a little bit, who are our Trill? Well, it's kind of trans people. If you talk about folks that can see things from multiple perspectives, as you've had to look at the world through one gender's eyes and another, that's a way of almost embodying this perception. And I could give you all this theory about trans leaders and leadership development, the qualities that make them senior leaders, or even reuse a quote from Liddell Hart to say why diversity is important. But let's not do that, because that's a way different story, and I'd love to get into it in the Q&A if you want. But if sci-fi taught us anything, it's about the power of stories. So I'm going to share just a couple stories in the time we have left about some transgender leaders within our military and the superpowers they developed by going through a transition experience. So I have talked a lot about perspective taking, and this is Lieutenant Commander Blake Dreeman. Blake, as the world perceived him, was one of the first submariners, I'll get that right someday, to integrate submarines when the world thought he was a woman. But Blake later transitioned and got this dramatic perspective shift as he kind of came into the world of the dominant culture within the military. And he's been able to use that shift in perspectives to challenge perceptions, to challenge the way things have always been done, and to use it for a good cause. But still to be able to draw on what those experiences were like before he was recognized as his gender. But there are many more than just that basic of perspective taking. That empathy that you get from seeing things through different lenses. Staff Sergeant Leanne Withrow talks about understanding the struggles of her soldiers, even when there are struggles she hasn't faced or things that she didn't even know might have existed. It allows her to connect with them, develop that empathy that makes her an outstanding leader in the Illinois National Guard. And Lieutenant Chris Moore here on the bottom just spoke yesterday at Pentagon Pride right after the SecDef. Outstanding officer and future leader in the Navy. But when he was told by tweet that his services were likely no longer going to be required in the United States military, he said, hell no. He showed the determination we want in our leaders, that again and again, they are going to prove themselves and say how dedicated they are to the cause of defending the country that they love in. And if he was going to be thrown out, he'd make sure the Navy knew they were losing the best damn surface warfare officer that they had. And he's proven that over and over again. It's not just on our side of the pond. Harry, a field grade officer in the United Kingdom Army, talked about his willingness to challenge policy after he transitioned. And he uses my favorite word, especially when that policy is rubbish. And the confidence he was given by being himself and that ability to make a stand and make a difference. Like, I don't have to hide who I am, but I can also talk about these other things now based on that, at my experiences. Some of these things, though, have kind of a flip side. As we talk communication and connection as a superpower, this vigilance that a lot of trans or gay, lesbian, bisexual folks develop is by being hyper vigilant and having to understand, well, who's in a room as I'm growing up? How do I not out myself? How can I read this audience so that I can either hide or connect? So there's a negative connotation, but there's also that positive of, well, now that I know how to read the room and I can make a connection with what do people actually want to hear? What do they want to see? How can I make that human to human connection that makes people pay attention or that makes me an effective communicator and leader? But we always have to be worried on any of these things about the flip side, because minority stress is a real thing and leaders can burn out before reaching these superpower pinnacles that they can get to. But just a couple more before I wrap up. I want to go back to Chris's experience about authenticity and that ability to make a team and an individual better when we remove the lying, faking, and hiding that so many of us do in the workplace. When we can set aside that mental energy that we dedicate to protecting ourselves and instead put that on the mission, that makes us all better as we move forward to create national security for this country. And Sergeant Sabrina Bruce, also from the United States Space Force, one of my favorite humans on this planet. She talks about how she can get better simply by accepting responsibility for the actions that previously embarrassed her and embracing that piece of her identity that said, you know what? Now I can go for these things and I'm going to develop as a leader because I've been able to set aside all those things that I was so self-critical about and that held me back. So a lot of these are just scratching the surface on some of those superpowers that are out there that make trans people incredible leaders, or at least give them the potential to be. And us being able to give them that potential is so important. So really, I want to question, where do we go with here? And Jordy gives us the caution of, this is what we don't want to do. We don't want these people like First Sergeant Dana Walker, whose shields were up for her career. She spent that time lying and hiding who she was, and she made bad decisions because of that fear and that, as she says, that inability to concede what may be construed as weakness. We can turn that on its head and use vulnerability as a tool to connect with the people that we work with and the people that we lead. So many situations where if you reveal something about yourself, people are then willing to reveal things to you that allows you to be a better leader, understand what's going on with the team, and make the environment better. But what we want to enable is what this junior officer in the Air Force says, is that where she came out so that others would know that they're not alone and make it possible for them to achieve their goals. Representation matters, whether it's in the sci-fi world or here on Earth. Having people that you can look up to and see that there are possibilities is just as incredible as that world of possibilities that opens up when a Trill gets their symbiont and all of a sudden sees things from 9, 10, or more different perspectives. It's an incredible ability to look up and say, you know what? I can do that someday. So I have one final ask from you from the Star Trek world in relation to trans rights. If the Klingons can get it right, I would hope that all of us can too. Because when Kor met Jadzia Dax and didn't recognize who she was, he then immediately self-corrected and embraced her for who she is right now. And if you can do that for the trans folks in your organization, for the other minorities, for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, the African Americans, the Hispanics, whoever might be there, embrace them for who they are. And they are going to be dedicated to you, dedicated to your team, and dedicated to the mission. And with that, I look forward to your questions and a fruitful discussion as we go forward.
Thanks so much, Bree, for that incredibly inspiring presentation, and I should say a well-timed one at that, given the month that we're in, celebrating all things trans rights in the entire community. So thank you very much. At this point, we're going to bring back everybody. So I'd like all my presenters to come back onto camera, unmute yourselves. I want to say, on behalf of the entire audience, on behalf of the entire NavyCon crew, behind the scenes, thanks to each of you for the hard work and the time taken to put your respective presentations together. You each shined, and I can safely say that I learned something quite a bit as I sat here today, and I'm not alone in that. But as we wrap up, we've got a few minutes left, and we're going to turn to some audience questions that we have lined up that we've pulled from Discord. And the first one, I thought this was a perfect way to tee things off. Who's the most politically astute character in Babylon 5, Star Wars, Star Trek? You pick your franchise, and I'll toss it up. The first one to speak up gets the lead out of the gate. Go ahead.
I'll go first. Probably Spock or Curzon Dax. They saw an opportunity to bring in the Klingons into the Khitomer Accord system, and they took it. And as a result, they gave the Alpha Quadrant, 80 years of peace. I realize this is more from a international relations, rather than politics per se. But yeah, I'll say they were the most politically astute in Star Trek.
Well, I will switch universes, and considering I named my daughter after her, I'm going to go with Delenn from Babylon 5. Amazing ability to navigate intergalactic politics, or galactic politics, excuse me, and make things happen for a greater good.
I saw a lot of immediate nods there, so I think you hit a nerve there, Bree. Anybody else?
I think for me, probably Bail Organa from Star Wars, because he manages to put together a resistance movement completely sort of, very, very swiftly as well, while facing total oppression, keeps it together for 19 years, and it's not even broken by planets being destroyed. So, he's got some skill there. Maybe not at avoiding super lasers, but everything else he's pretty good at.
Could have worked on his agility a little bit there. Maybe, better timed his trip back to Alderaan. I don't know. Elsa or Harrison?
So I'd have to agree on Delenn, and I would also add, I think Jakar is one of the characters in Babylon 5 who progressed the most in his political astuteness and capacity to manage complex intergalactic and politics, and I think really, and as an advocate for the Narn and as an ambassador, came a long way in his capacity to build relationships and try to put some understanding as well. But definitely, I think Delenn, I think is impressive and certainly puts Sharon into shame in some cases.
Harrison, I see you've strategically maneuvered to have the last word on this question.
So I'm going to, of course, throw Sheev Palpatine into the realm as a person who was able to perfectly manipulate a wide variety of different groups representing different ideologies, different interests, different cultural backgrounds, and each with their own different strengths and blind spots, which is obviously not very easy to do.
Well, when you have Sith powers, it helps.
Yes, being able to read the mind of your opponents does help in politics. A skill that I wish some folks would learn and others would lose.
And, if I could only rock a hood as well as old Sheev could, I would be, going some places in life. Merle, if you could queue up the next question, please. Has anyone done work linking events during the time of episode composition with the future events that are represented, or explored biographies or interviews with writers or producers? And I'm presuming, go ahead, Harrison.
Presuming that I'm reading this question correctly, there's been a lot written about the influences on George Lucas, looking at the aftershock of Watergate and the sort of exposure of the political manipulation of the Nixon administration. And while I would say that Lucas's historical grasp of warfare may not be quite as astute as his grasp of visual effects and film production, he did cite specifically the American Revolution and Vietnam as two particular thematic sources for the style of warfare that he wanted to see, which was that large empire versus underdog with innovation.
Matt, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, just very briefly on that, Chris Kempshall, who's an academic, I think he's at Leeds, I'm not sure, has got a book coming out next year, I think, which goes into the politics of Star Wars, and I know he's really gets into the interviews with kind of cast and with directing staff, so could be interesting on that.
Other Matt.
So first of all, those are all past events, not future events, so that's a party foul. Second, a good example of a writer and producer who has big influence on that would be Ron Moore, who, while he was never in the military, he was in ROTC in college. And you can kind of start to see, right when he comes on DS9, and of course, how he ran Battlestar Galactica. The big influence from that.
Yeah, outstanding. Let's cycle to the next question because we've only got a couple minutes left. If the Empire had beaten the rebellion, would they, Palpatine, have then created another enemy in order to maintain the enemy resource ideology? My brain's ability to form actual words is gone now. Ideology momentum. There we go. Go ahead, Matt.
First of all, I disagree with the premise. Again, the rebellion is not the bad guy. The rich is not the enemy of the Galactic Empire. The rich core worlds are. A bunch of guys running around in the Outer Rim does not pose a threat to Coruscant, Kuat, Corellia, Alderaan. them trying to go their own way is what poses a threat. So if they kill all the if they kill the Alliance leadership, that's great. It doesn't solve the problem.
And this is going to be our last question. So if any of the panelists have any comments on this particular question. I don't know that they would need to create another enemy so much as just wait for another one to show up. I think in the expanded canon that we currently have, it's pretty clear that it's just a matter of time before some evil entity lurking out in the galaxy somewhere in the unknown regions crops up. And quite frankly, I think Palpatine's entire focus is on his own self-perpetuation, his perpetuation of his own power. And the rebels happen to be a direct threat to that, which is why they earned the Empire's ire. But I don't know how much care they would really have to anybody else. Well, I think that's going to do it for us. I will go around the horn one last time if anybody has any parting words. And I want to thank everybody for watching. Bree, we'll start with you. Anything for the group, for the audience?
It was a pleasure to be here. This was a lot of fun to bring some loves together.
Thanks so much, Harrison.
I really appreciate you guys for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate the opportunity to watch all of your presentations. They were so fantastic. So thank you.
Matt Booker.
Hey, as always, this is always a blast. Thanks for having me. Live long and prosper.
Elsa.
Thanks to the whole NavyCon community. Happy and honored to be here and learned a lot from the conversation. So looking forward to continuing the discussion going forward. Take care, all. And
last word goes to Matthew.
Worth staying up until 02:30 for. And now I'm going to go on to Discord and answer more questions.
I want to thank all of you for watching, whether you're watching live or after the fact, and welcome to the NavyCon family. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.